Thanks everybody for being here. And today's topic is something that I have talked about in many places. I've written a lot about it, and also my podcast, Enemies, Word of Wisdom, deals with this topic. I'm going to sketch it out a little, and then I'd like to answer questions about it. I want to tell you first why I think it's an important topic and a complex one. Probably the most important aspect is that most people identify the self with their body. They sort of say, I'm in here and the world is out there. And then they protect themselves by protecting their body, and they identify themselves with their body. And you might be saying, okay, of course, it would be weird if I didn't do that. And yes, it is true. It would be weird if you didn't do that. And you probably would not have a chance to walk around with ordinary people if you didn't, to some extent, identify yourself with your body. But you probably know that when you came into life, you came in inside of somebody else's body. You came in as a dyad, not as a solo. And you probably know, if you know anything about developmental psychology, that it takes the infant at least a year and a half to locate herself or himself in the body. In other words, all of our perceptions are mixed together. And that's why I teach a lot about what I call the snow globe of subjectivity. So that your perceptions, that you feel that you're inside of the body and you see a world out there, those are all coming through the same cortex, which is yours. And they're also coming through the same nervous system, which is yours. All of your perceptions go all the way through the nervous system back to the cortex before you perceive them. So you are creating or constructing a world out there and a self in here. So that's like a very big subject, and I'm not going to go into the depth of that subject because I have done that many times. And I just taught a class that will be recorded on the snow globe of subjectivity. There's a podcast on the snow globe of subjectivity. There are a number of podcasts that deal with the idea that the human self is an interactive process. And today I'm just going to touch on some of the big points, and then I'd like to hear from you and answer your questions. So the very first thing that I want to say about just the word self is that if I ask 100 people, what does that word mean? I get roughly 100 answers. There's a lot of overlap around an answer like my body, like in here, like that's the self. But a lot of people have a certain idea about what the self is that's quite different from somebody else's idea about what the self is. And one reason that's the case is that self is not a thing. It is not a palpable thing that you can say, well, you might not agree about whether that chair is actually maroon or if it's red, but you pretty much agree it's a chair. People don't have difficulty if I say, well, what's a chair? They will tell me pretty much with a pretty high degree of consensus about what a chair is and what we do with it. But if I ask, what's a self? There's not a high degree of consensus, and there are a lot of different opinions. So that the word itself associates with something that is hard to define, and also something that we don't have a lot of consensus about, and something that often gets mixed up with the body. So that's one side of the picture. And then here's the other side of the picture. From a Buddhist perspective, because of course all of my classes are grounded in Buddhism as well as psychology and cognitive science, from a Buddhist perspective, there is something that gets translated as no self. And so some people say there's a self and a no self. That gets even more confusing. But what that refers to, when the Buddha, and I'm talking about Shakyamuni Buddha here, the living Buddha, was teaching around 2,600 years ago, what he taught about his own awakening was that this quality, this, let's say, constant, stable quality called Atman, which meant the eternal self or the eternal soul, did not exist. And so he instead taught on Atman. It's translated like no self, but it's really more like self with an interdiction symbol over it. You know, like no smoking, you have a cigarette with a round circle with a red circle and a diagonal line, means like no smoking. So on Atman is basically like no self, self with that line through it. So, but the self that was getting deconstructed was the Atman, which means the eternal self or the soul. The Buddha said, on Atman, no self. In other words, there's nothing eternal that is identified as separate from everything else. And so the Buddha was pointing out that all so-called things are all impermanent and they're all interdependent. There is nothing that is separated from all other things ever in this world. In this existence that we're in, all of what we regard as things are all participating with all other things, and they're all interactive with all other things, and they're all impermanent. So there's no eternal thing called a self that's separated from everything else. Nothing, not you or me or a soul or an Atman or anything. So when the Buddha was teaching, he was teaching about a very big property of experience, which is the question, is there anything that's eternal and separated out from everything else, like an atom, for example? And he said no. And that was through his enlightenment that he made that discovery. All things are dependent on each other. All things are arising and passing away. And so there is nothing separated out. Now, that happens to include yourself. And so what we can say about the self is that it's an interactive process that is established in order for human beings to use their complex brains, because our brains actually convey to us all sorts of perceptions about all sorts of things that are going on simultaneously. Like you can hear and see and feel. It's all happening all at once, but you have to sort it out in order to get around in your body and become the captain of your body ship. And so in order to do that, you have to have some sense that there's some unity in the whole thing. And that unity actually contributes to the way that you are able to cohere and experience yourself as inside of a body, the way that you have the sense that there's continuity to your life. You have a life story. You say you grew up somewhere, then you became 14, then you became 25, and you moved, and you did this and that, even though you know that none of those people are the same people, because all the cells of that body have changed, all the thoughts have changed, the appearance has changed, everything has changed. But you regard it as continuous and you have a story about it. And also, you are also an agent or a cause of your own actions. So you can intend something and do it. You can imagine you want to say something and you can say it. And so these qualities of a human self, this coherence in a body, continuity of a sense of being over time, and also the sense of being an agent, all characterize what it means to be a human self or a human subject who can do things and say things, has intentionality, responsibility, etc. All of those things that are developed in the human self as a result of having a human body and human brain, they all depend on relationships with others, other human selves. So that the human self is relational. And it's fundamentally relational because it comes into being as a dyad. It doesn't come in solo. And so it's always relational from its beginnings. And so it's always interactive, and it depends on interaction for its other functions, for its agency, continuity, coherence. We learn languages, cultures, we have stories, we have identities, tribes, families. All of those things contribute to what we call a self. So that's the nature of the human self. It's fundamentally interactive. The other thing that you should know before we go into other kind of conversation about it is that in order to know yourself, you need others. At any stage of life, you need to inquire into others about who you are, because you're not solo. And you share a language and a culture which limits a way of seeing and understanding and narrating. And so then as you get in touch with people from other languages and other cultures, you find different selves. And they can also help you see yourself more clearly, because you can find out, you know, a little bit more about what your culture is by knowing other cultures. Similarly, you need people with different ideas, because you find out your ideas by finding out how they're different from others. So in that way, the human self is highly interactive, interactional, relational, and it also is not a thing. It isn't a thing somewhere. So that's the Cliff Notes version of this. And I'm going to open it up now to questions, conversations, and you know, we can wander around in this wood of the self. You know, we could go into issues about identity, about a relationship, about subjectivity, about Buddhism, about Rowe Center. I mean, there are many, many possible directions to go. But I'd like to hear from you why you're here and what you'd want to know.
Alan Coulter here. So I'm interested mostly, well, it's a big topic, but right now what I'm interested in is the subjectivity aspect of it, because that's probably where over my lifetime I've haven't taken it into account as much as I would have liked. So I'm not sure I have a question, except I'm interested in this idea of, I think you've said in other classes, as you know, somewhere between, I forget what it was, but up to 90% of what think I'm experiencing and relating and whatever is subjective.
Right.
And so certainly that does relate somehow to, even if I can't articulate it that well, my perception of self.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let me just ask you something, Alan. I said 45 to 85% at any given moment is individual of our experience, and so yes, subjective. Our experience is, you could say, really all, even always, you could say subjective. You could argue that when you're using mathematics, it's more objective, but so if your experience is like up to 85 or 90% individual, do you like that or do you dislike that? Does it strike you one way or the other?
I would, if I had to like or dislike, I'd dislike it.
And why?
Well, because then it feels like I can never be quite sure of what actually happened, or uh,
And
what my
what's true, maybe? What's really
what's
true?
true, or what my experience would then uh, have me expect in a for in a similar situation. Or I would just feel like, some ways I see it positive, much less trusting of my own perception, which
Right.
allow me to be more uh, open to others' perceptions. But it would also make the unsurety of things might be unnerving.
Right, right. Well, I think you've said it very well. I mean, I think that the experience that you're describing is part of the reason why I'm talking about this, is that I'm glad you got that experience, because that's what I'm trying to convey when I talk about subjectivity. And even what I try to convey when I talk about um, the interactive nature of the human self. So, as you said in other classes, and I'll review this right now, I talk about the snow globe of human subjectivity. And another word for that could be self. I mean, the reason I don't use the word self is that it is so poorly, there's so little consensus about what it means, that I just like the word snow globe because everybody seems to know what that is, and we can talk about that more easily. But yes, when I talk about a self, I do mean the experience of what's called an individual subject. That means a person, and a self is actually a little different. Like person, the word person we usually use when we mean the objective observation. I see a person in the room. We don't typically say I see a self in the room. The self part is usually the subjective experience of being an individual. And when I teach the snow globe thing, I'll just review it, that there are 6 domains in our perceptions of ourselves and our subjectivity. And those domains are seeing out and seeing in, hearing out and hearing in, feeling out and feeling in. And they are illustrated and given quite a bit of their own narratives in 2 of the books, on little ebooks that are more like zines that are on my website. So, I'll review again that seeing out is when we look into what we regard as the world. Seeing in is seeing into the mind's eye. Hearing out is hearing out into the sounds of the world, which include other people's voices speaking to us. If we know their language, we then translate that language into our own meaning. If we don't know their language, it just sounds like sounds. And then hearing in is hearing our own voice talking to us. And we can hear that by just hearing what we're saying to ourselves, or we can say things to ourselves and hear ourselves by hearing in. And feeling out is when we feel the body sensations, which include everything from pain and pleasure to sensations like your clothes touching your body, or your stomach hurting, or your throat hurting, or whatever, all of the body sensations. And then feeling into the body is feeling the emotional centers. Those are the activations of our emotional motivations, which occur usually in the gut, the stomach, the solar plexus, the throat, and the head. So feeling in, that is when we're feeling our emotional activations. Feeling out, we're feeling the body sensations, the body boundaries, and the experiences of pain and pleasure. And then hearing out, we're hearing out into the world, hearing in, we're hearing into our own minds. Seeing out, we're seeing out into the world. Seeing in, we're seeing the images in our own minds. So all of those together constitute something that is highly individual. And the way that you perceive the chair in the room, or what your friend is saying, and the way you remember what happened yesterday, the way you understand various kinds of universal truths, all of those things are subjective. And so they are limited. And it turns out they're pretty limited. And that's one reason why we need others. We need other selves, you know, in order to get some stability around what is true, what did happen yesterday, you know, and how do I remember this? I might remember this quite differently from the way you remember. Like, what happened on the last 4th of July? Oh, well, I remember we did this. What do you remember we did? We need others to complete our sense of even what it is that we think, or what it is that we feel, because we are so subjective. And that also should lead us, ideally, in an ideal human condition, to real modesty about what we know, and also curiosity about what others know. But because of our emotional motivations, and because of the difficulties of our memories, some of which are really unreliable, we often take a position in regard to our ideals, and then we protect ourselves and promote ourselves and fight with others. And so we're not very curious then about what others think, because we're protecting ourselves and our own snow globe. So that's kind of the tour of individual subjectivity. And I think once you deeply embrace this, which is very much based on contemporary neuroscience, cognitive science, also on Buddhism and developmental psychology, when you embrace this sense of yourself, there's a much greater mystery about your life. There's a much greater mystery about moment-to-moment contact with others than if you assume that the world is out there and that you are inside and that you know exactly how things are.
Related to Buddhism, where does karma enter in as related to self/no self?
Okay, that's a really good question. So these answers, of course, are not simple answers, but you all seem to be bearing with me on things. So in Buddhism, there are essentially two discourses, and they happen alongside each other. And one is the discourse about emptiness, no-thingness, impermanence, interdependence, and the nature of reality. And the other discourse is the discourse about human intentional actions. That's the discourse of karma. And so from a Buddhist perspective, you come into your lifetime having experienced many, many other forms, many, many other lifetimes. But you come in through, if you're a human being, you come in through a particular intercourse between two human beings. And then, you know, you're gradually developed, you're born into a family. I like to say you're talked into being by your family. And as you develop, you become responsible for your actions and what you say. So there are different, how do I want to say this, milestones of responsibility. There's a big one by the age of 7, there's another at 14, and another at 21 to 25, let's say. Each one of those milestones make you more responsible for what you do and say, because you have more capacity to recognize the implications of your actions and your words. And as you become more responsible, you carry more weight in regard to the consequences of what you do and say. And so from a Buddhist perspective, when you come into this lifetime, you're carrying karmic themes or marks or tendencies. You could think of them as habits from other lifetimes. And you will tend to bring them again into your perceptions and your actions in this lifetime. And you have the possibility of changing those or correcting them once you become intentional, once you can think about your own thoughts and feelings, once you can decide what you're going to do and do it or not do it. And so Buddhism teaches a lot of well, relatively speaking, a lot. I mean, it depends on different traditions teach more, but teaches quite a bit on how to conduct yourself ethically. These are called precepts, and also paramitas are perfections to guide you along the way until you get some deeper insight into what the consequences are of the things that you do and say. So karmically, in any particular lifetime, if you intend harmful actions and carry them out, there are consequences that are harmful to you and your mind stream, let's say, that can go not simply into this lifetime, but future lifetimes. And then on the other hand, if you intend virtuous actions and you speak and act in a virtuous, or let's call it a skillful way, the positive consequences karmically manifest both in this lifetime and in other lifetimes. So from a Buddhist perspective, the discourse that is connected to karma is the discourse about intentional action. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Moving right along.
Moving along. There's another couple of messages here that I can ask. A couple of questions related to the human psyche. How can we best address the possible negative effects of past interaction that may be held in the body as a trauma or as trauma?
Okay, that's another really good question. So let's go back to the snow globe idea, first of all. So let me just say the very first thing that I say always, the best way to change anything or to do anything is to first become aware of what you're doing. I mean, so before you can do anything, you first have to become aware. And again, this connects to our intentions, because we may not be watching our intentions, and we may just impulsively do something, and we might hurt somebody, and we didn't intend to hurt them. From a karmic point of view, if you really didn't intend to, then it's not such a difficult consequence. From an interpersonal point of view, if you didn't intend to hurt your partner but you hurt them, there might be interpersonal consequence that is important there. But so what within your snow globe, trauma, so let me just say what I think trauma is, because trauma gets thrown around also. So trauma is some kind of wound that left you threatened, so that the ways that you see the world, hear yourself, see yourself, all the ways that you respond are now constrained in the area of that wound. And so our wounds affect us, our psychological and our physical wounds affect us in all of those domains. And seeing out, seeing in, hearing out, hearing in, feeling out, and feeling in. they lay down habitual self-protective patterns in those domains so that we don't see, hear, and feel things in an open way, in a more, well, you could say equanimous or open-hearted or open-minded way. We're more contracted and protective because we don't want to be wounded in the way that we were already wounded. Some kinds of traumas, particularly interpersonal traumas, particularly emotional traumas, will, because of the ways we protect ourselves and we form what are called defenses, or sometimes they're called adaptive mechanisms. We have habits of reacting to others and habits of reacting to ourselves. Sometimes, and this is a very strange thing about humans, our reactions actually recreate the trauma. And I think that the way I understand that happening is that a lot of the things that are most painful for us are not remembered very clearly. And so they're not very conscious. They become a part of our emotional memory system, which is in the midbrain and involves this little organ called the amygdala, which is the fight or flight one, and the other one that's called the hippocampus, looks like a little seahorse. Those two, the hippocampus and the amygdala, will activate us in a present moment to experience that moment as though it was the past. So that if, for example, you got beaten by your father, and your father, every time he beat you, stopped to tie his shoes and then he took his belt off. In the future, when you see someone tie their shoes, you might start to get activated with fear that you don't even know about. And then if they touch their belt, you start to react to that person as though they were going to harm you or hurt you, which then may irritate them, and they may turn on you in some way that causes them to seem to repeat something that happened to you in the past. And this is sort of oversimplifying it, but because human beings are kind of hardwired to protect themselves from emotional threat as well as real danger, we have something called anxiety. And the anxiety causes a fear response in us, even when there's nothing dangerous going on. It's just because we associate somebody's movement or the word they say or the way they do something with something that was dangerous in the past. But that very association and that very habitual reaction, whatever we used initially to defend ourselves, may bring about in the present moment a situation that was a lot like the past. So the true trauma reaction is when you create in the present the problems that you already experienced in the past and you don't know it's happening. So, mainly you have to first of all notice that you're doing something that is extreme and habitual and repetitive. And you might be doing it in the way you see things, in the way you hear things, in the way you feel things, both in your body and in your emotions. And what will be the really important symptom of it is that it's repetitive. It seems like it happens again and again and again. And that's when you need to begin to investigate it. Sometimes you can investigate these things through mindfulness. Sometimes you can investigate them through self-help, and sometimes you have to go to therapy. So there's no one single thing you can do about trauma. But the important thing is to recognize if you seem stuck in repetitive patterns and habits in your relationships and in your feelings about yourself, that repetition is a sign that there is something wrong. And if it is something that you repeat that seems really severe, like very severe self-attacks, or you get into a relationship again and again that has, a severely punitive aspect to it, and that you become familiar with the repetition, you can be pretty sure that's associated with trauma. Then you have to find out how you're going to investigate that, because it's up to you in your own snow globe to find a way to work with yourself. It cannot ever be up to somebody else to do that, because nobody can be inside of your snow globe. So it's up to you to find a way to work with your experience until it becomes tolerable, so you can become interested in life. So that's a long, long answer, but I don't know how to make it shorter. So, so there's another question.
Janet has unmuted herself. Janet, do you have a question?
Oh, yeah. I did at the beginning, but I forgot what it was now.
Oh, Janet, hi.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I don't see
Yes.
you, but I hear you.
Yeah, I'm
Yes,
here.
Nice to hear you. Yes.
Yes. You were talking, we have the individual, but everything that we have that is individual, we have in common.
Well, not everything. Let's say you're making a good point that we all have a certain cookie cutter aspect, and that has to do with the form that we're in. We're in the form of a Homo sapien, or a human being, and so we all have pretty much the same embodiment. With variations, but it's the same form. We all have the same kind of brain perceptual system, et cetera, et cetera. But the way we experience our moment-to-moment experience is quite individual. And so that's why we fight so much with each other about small issues, like where to put the cereal, things like that, because we do have a very strong experience of being individual, and we have very different kinds of perceptions of what happened, memories of what happened, also interpretations. Yet what you're saying is important, because we're all here as human beings. So we're in a species. The species is constrained. And so we're not cats and dogs, we're not bats or fishes, we're not rocks or trees. And so in that way, we share a common ground.
Yes.
We all, yeah.
But what I was saying is that taking that, each one has that individual experience. That's really interesting. We could turn that around to be a good thing. Like, wow, how did you see that? And
Yes.
you can learn from that. Well, that's a piece of cake. Just do it.
Yes, that's it. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Just everybody do it. It's quite an adventure.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes,
you've got it. So you've got it. That's it.
That's it. Yes.
Thank you.
Nice to hear you.
Is the self that you were talking about at the beginning, is it the capital self, as in the Jungian self equals soul, or the self as ego?
So that's got to be a Jungian asking that question. So let me say it like this. It's a very complex question. I have written an essay in the Cambridge Companion to Jung, which is on Buddhism and Jung, and it answers this question in depth. So the Jungian terminology, like the big S self, it always reminds me of the big S self, but it's the big S self is the archetype of the self. That archetype, like Janet was mentioning, is connected with any human being. In other words, all human beings have the natural imprint or design to create the experience of being an individual subject that has coherence, continuity, agency, relationality. And all human beings, that I mentioned them all, coherence, continuity, agency, relationality, all human beings, if they develop through their relationships, will create a self that is coherent, continuous, has agency, and has relationality. All human beings have some pathology in that creation of self. In other words, there's either we have problems with our agency, we have problems with our coherence, we have problems with our continuity, we have problems with our relationality. Nobody has a perfect cookie cutter ability to create an individual subjectivity as a human that goes completely smoothly. Now, within the experience of creating this universal experience of being an individual subject, various things happen to us personally. As I said earlier, you're born into a particular family. You come in a particular moment in that family. Everybody has a different family. Everybody, you know, if you have 5 children in a family, each child has a different family because they came in at a different time with different players in the family. Everybody's given a name, usually in advance or fairly quickly. That name already indicates about something about who you are going to be, what you're going to mean in life. And as you go into your personal situations, you develop defenses around your identity. And that is the ego from the point of view of Jung's idea of an ego complex. It forms from the archetype of the self, but then you have it. My ego, growing up in Akron, Ohio, having a particular set of parents, particular family situation, is really quite different from my friend who grew up in Kyoto, Japan. Even though we both share the archetype of the self, we both have coherence, continuity, agency, blah, blah, blah. My friend in Kyoto probably would never emphasize, for example, competition in her identity. She would always say, no, I'm not better at that than you. No, I didn't accomplish that. Because she has natural anxiety about standing out in the group. Because many people, and I'm not saying everyone in Asia is changing, but the general tendency among particularly Japanese Asian families is to identify more with the group, not with individual achievements. So you might be very proud of your tribe, but you don't want to stand out. In Akron, Ohio, you wanted to stand out. You wanted to compete. You wanted to be best on the girls' team or whatever. So our ego complexes are quite different because we have different cultures, different families, different languages, different emphases in all of these things on these qualities of being an individual human being. So your ego complex is the individual development that is the, let's say, growth out of the archetype of the self. So I hope that's understandable. There's another question?
Yes, someone was asking, can you explain the concept of coherence?
Okay, I sort of feel like I'm like a dictionary right now, but that's okay. So coherence, again, what you have to kind of get the experience of the infant. And if you have been with an infant, I mean like a young infant, they're thrashing around and you can sort of tell that their nervous system is not organized. And they have difficulty even sort of experiencing their embodiment. They're often kind of shaking. And so the nervous system, as it lays down its tracks, more and more you organize this kind of, let's say, disorganized mess of perceptions into the experience of being in here in a body with the world out there. So at the age of about 18 months, you've already practiced walking, you've already practiced crawling, you've already got some sense of the gravity, how it works, et cetera, et cetera. At around 18 months, these self-conscious emotions click in and you begin to experience yourself as I am in here and the world is out there. That makes you more vulnerable in some ways. When you're 12 months old, you throw yourself around in the world. You can run fast, you can jump over a ledge or do a lot of dangerous things because the world doesn't feel altogether like you are in here. one little vulnerable being, and the whole world is out there. It's just things happen, you kind of move along. Over time, and it takes all the way until really about 18 years old, you develop gradually the experience, I am inside of this body, and it's a certain kind of body with certain kinds of habits, certain kinds of feelings. And at that point, you cohere pretty well as a body. In other words, you're perceiving, you're experiencing yourself as in here and out there. You're organizing. This is the way you're organizing your perceptions. It's not like this is a thing. You are always making it into a thing. So you have the coherence of, I am a body, and this is the way my body works, except when you fall asleep at night. And then maybe you're a bird, and then maybe you go through a wall, and your body's an entirely different thing. But you usually, in your dreams, you do experience yourself as having some kind of body, but it's not generally the same body you're walking around in. And then at the point that there is coherence, you can also, through anxiety, dissociation, trauma, you can depersonalize, your consciousness can move away from the body so that you don't seem to be inside of your body. And people have experiences of themselves being above their bodies when they're in trauma. Sometimes, once when I was having surgery, when I was in the recovery process, I popped out of my body and I could hear everything going on in the room, but I was about 2 feet above my body, my consciousness was. So that, you could call that non-coherent. I wasn't a coherent body. So we have experiences of being incoherent when we're in our rapid eye movement dreaming. And then we have it if we have a depersonalization. And some people, when they have a lot of trauma, have extensive depersonalization. They experience themselves as outside of their bodies. So coherence is cohering within a body in which you feel like you're inside of the body, and you kind of predict where it goes, and you have the sense of moving it. There's a lot to it. And of course, if you're paralyzed, if you have a neurological disease, there are a lot of other things that can happen to disrupt the coherence of your body. But it is something that develops, and it's something that you're maintaining through your consciousness. It's not a given. So again, I hope that's understandable. And again, I've written a lot about the archetype of the self. If you look up particularly archetype of the self, Young-Eisendrath, I think you will see not just my writing, but perhaps also some of my talks. I did a talk on trauma and transcendence at Pacifica, I think last spring, or maybe the spring before that, and that's online. And in the Cambridge Companion to Jung, both editions, I've edited that with Terence Dawson, but both editions have essays by me that include aspects of the archetype of the self. The first edition, which is in 2008, my essay is on gender. And in the second edition, the first edition is 1999, the second edition is 2008, and that's on Buddhism and Jung. So and there's one more question, I'm told.
Yeah, so this person writes in, so do I understand that a recurring felt boundary is necessary to develop coherence?
Yes. Yes, and this is another thing that's, like, there's so many aspects to all these topics. People who have autistic disorders, they often have difficulties with coherence, and so they do things they spin around or they pat themselves a lot to experience themselves as inside of their body. That gives them more of a feeling of the coherence, because that function, which is called it's called autistic contiguous function, the ability to experience yourself as coherent in your body. If you have a disruption of that functioning, then you have to do things to feel that boundary. And so you see people doing that when they don't feel the boundary of the body. Yes, it's the boundary, particularly the boundary, but also the sense that you're inside of it. Okay? Everybody had all their questions answered on the interactive process of the self. It's a very big subject. I do think we've covered things from a number of angles, and I'm kind of pleased with a variety of questions, and I hope that you see how big the topic is. If you come away from this class with just one insight, I would be very, very happy, which is that the self is not a thing, and that we're always creating the sense of being an individual subject. And even though it's an archetype that actually is built in, the habit of doing this, or the design to do it is built in, it doesn't exist somewhere. It's not a thing. So that's the big takeaway. And you need others to maintain it.
There was another person chimed in. Can you give a bit of insight on continuity?
Okay, that's much easier than coherence. Continuity is the story you tell yourself about having existed over time. Because, how to say this? You're creating yourself moment by moment by moment. You probably notice there's only the present moment ever. So there's moment by moment by moment. And in these present moments, you are thinking about or narrating the past, or you're imagining or planning or predicting the future. And so continuity is the sense that you go on being over time. So you have the experience that you are the same person who was that little baby in the photograph, or who was the little kid in the video, and then was the teenager at the prom, and then was the young adult who had you have the storyline, and you have the belief that you are that person, but you really are not, and you kind of know that too. And so if you altogether lose your continuity, that's because you lost certain kinds of memory functions and you can no longer image yourself. Then you aren't really just then an ordinary person anymore. And so, but some people lose parts of their continuity because of trauma, or because of some kind of difficulty, like becoming a refugee, for example. And so you might, I find people sometimes saying, well, I have no memory between the age of 4 and 8. Like it just blanks out for me, or these 3 months of 1 year blank out. That's loss of continuity in your narrative, and you recognize the blank out. Otherwise, you assume that that narrative is describing something that actually happened. But all it's doing is describing the narrative in this moment. It's telling the narrative of what you believe. Now you say, well, I have the evidence, I have the photographs, or I have the videos, or whatever. But those videos and photographs are not who you are now. And so, you refer back to them as evidence. But the story, the narrative, is the continuity. And when you don't have parts of it, you can feel kind of weird.
Thank you, Polly. We have about a minute left, and I do want to get a couple of announcements in before we say goodbye. Next week at the same time is Trust in Couple Relationship, What Breaks It and What Heals It. So that's at 4 o'clock Eastern next Monday. And continuing on Saturday is Living Together Without Falling Apart, Session 8. However, you can watch any of those videos. They're all available on the website, and kind of join in on Saturday, even if you haven't been participating all along. And also very exciting is a new section of the website. It's an e-learning platform where Polly is going to be introducing a 16 class series of videos called Making Deeper Contact, using real dialogue to expand your awareness and skills for yourself and your relationships. So that is in development currently. So I don't know, Polly, if you want to say anything about that, but all of these classes are in conjunction with the Rowe Center and can be found on the website.
So I want to say that Making Deeper Contact, we hadn't even told you, Lori, but we've changed the subtitle because we don't want people to think that it's just about real dialogue. So it's expanding your skills and awareness to be in closer contact with your experience. And it'll range over the experiences of illness, life, death, the nature of the world, to your relationships. And it's going to be basically teaching from this general perspective that I do of psychology, cognitive science, Buddhism, relationship, and trying to put the bigger pieces of the puzzle together, even starting with what is the world? What is this world that we're in? And it will be in 4 different subsections. Between each subsection will be an Ask Me Anything class where people come on live with me. So you'll have a chance to have a conversation, but the classes will be recorded as part of this e-learning platform. And I'm really excited about it. It's the first time I've done this kind of thing. I hope you join me in it. The e-booklets are available, which are on the Skill of Real Dialogue. Those are available on the website. I also wanted to announce the class that I just did, Lori, but I don't remember the name that I did for the Jungians in Zurich and London. It was called The Archetype of Contagion. Is that what it's called? Okay. It's called The Archetype of Contagion, and it's about our current situation and the wearing of masks and what that signals, and that will be free, and it will be on YouTube probably in a few days. So it was live in the last hour, and they'll put the YouTube recording of it up soon, and that will be free. So that's it. Thank you. Thanks for being here, everybody. Thank you. Nice to see you all. Thank you.